Hey everyone and welcome. So every company that sells a physical product has inventory, right? But what happens when that super popular item suddenly isn't so popular anymore? Maybe it gets damaged, or a new trend comes along and demand just vanishes. All of a sudden, that inventory is worth way less than you paid for it. This is a huge problem for businesses, and today we are breaking down the very specific accounting rules for how they have to deal with it.
So picture this. You're sitting on a warehouse packed with product, and you know its value is tanking. What do? Well, you can't just cross your fingers and hope for the best. There's a core rule in accounting called the principle of conservatism, and it basically says you can't pretend your assets are worth more than they really are. You've got to face the music and officially write down its value. So let's dive into exactly how that's done. All right, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll talk about the fundamental principle that drives all of this. Then, we're going to hit a really crucial fork in the road that changes everything depending on which way you go. From there, we'll explore the two different paths. One is the more complex cost or market method, and the other is the much simpler cost or NRV method. And finally, we'll look at how companies actually put that loss on the books.
So this entire process is built on one simple idea, the principle of conservatism. And what that really means is that accountants are supposed to always err on the side of caution. When it comes to inventory, that means you can't list it on your books for more than you can realistically get for it. This situation comes up all the time, because of physical damage, or maybe the product just becomes obsolete, or hey, maybe customers just don't want it anymore.
Okay, now this is probably the most critical part of the whole thing. Before you can value your inventory, you have to know how the company accounts for its inventory costs in the first place. That single choice is the fork in the road we just mentioned, and it sends you down one of two completely different paths for figuring out what that inventory is actually worth today.
And here are those two paths, side by side. On the left, if a company uses inventory methods called LIFO or the retail inventory method, they have to follow a rule called lower of cost or market, or LCM for short. But if they use FIFO or the average cost method, they get to use a much simpler rule, lower of cost or net realizable value, or LCNRV. And trust me, as we're about to see, this one choice makes a massive difference to the bottom line.
All right, let's tackle path number one, the more complicated one. Lower of cost or market, or LCM. This is the one for companies using LIFO. Now this one has a few moving parts, so stick with me here as we break it all down.
So the first thing you need to know is that the word market here is a little bit tricky. It doesn't just mean what would it cost to replace this thing today. No, instead, you should think of it as a specific target value that's actually squeezed between a ceiling, which is the highest it can be, and a floor, which is the lowest it can be.
So let's talk about that ceiling. The ceiling has a name, net realizable value, or NRV. And honestly, the easiest way to think about NRV is as the inventory's true cash value. It's what you think you can sell it for, minus any costs to finish it up, sell it, and ship it out. It makes total sense, right? The market value can't possibly be higher than what you can actually pocket in the end. And then we have the floor. To find the floor, you just take that same NRV we just calculated and subtract a normal profit margin. Now, why do this? Well, this rule exists to stop companies from getting clever and taking a huge artificial loss right now, only to turn around and report a giant artificial profit later when the item finally sells. The market value isn't allowed to drop below this floor.
Okay, and this visual right here shows how it all comes together. To find your official market value, you literally line up the three numbers we just talked about, the ceiling, the floor, and the current replacement cost. Then you just pick the one in the middle, not the highest, not the lowest, the one that's smack dab in between. That number becomes your market value for the final comparison. So let's do a quick recap of this whole LCM process. Step 1, figure out the ceiling. Step 2, figure out the floor. Step 3, find the current replacement cost. Step 4, pick the middle value of those three to lock in your market price. And finally, for Step 5, you compare that market price to what you originally paid for the item, and you just choose the lower one. That's your new inventory value.
This table is a fantastic example of how this actually works in practice. Let's just focus on item B. Okay, so the ceiling is $65 and the floor is $58. But look, the current replacement cost is only $55, which is below the floor. The rule says we can't go below the floor, so we have to bump that number up to the floor value of $58. That becomes our market price. And since $58 is lower than the original $60 cost, the inventory gets written down to $58.
Okay, whew, we made it through the complicated route. So now let's switch gears and head down the second path, which I promise is much simpler. This is the lower of cost or net realizable value rule, LCNRV, and it's for companies using FIFO or average cost.
And I gotta tell you, the difference here is like night and day. Seriously, forget about ceilings, floors, middle values, all that stuff. The rule is incredibly direct. You just compare what you originally paid, the cost, to the net realizable value we talked about earlier, and you pick whichever one is lower. That's it, a simple two-way comparison.
And this quote from the source material really puts it plainly. If your cost is higher than your NRV, your true cash value, that difference is simply recorded as a loss. It's clean, it's simple, no extra steps.
And this slide right here, this is the punchline to the whole story. Just look at this. We have the exact same data for the exact same company, but two totally different outcomes. On the left, using that complex LIFO and LCM method, they have to take a $15,000 write-down. But on the right, if they'd use the simpler FIFO and LCNRV method, that write-down is only $10,000.
That is a $5,000 difference in the loss they have to report to the world. Nothing about the actual inventory changed, not one item. The only thing that changed was the accounting rule they were required to use. It's just a perfect illustration of how a seemingly small accounting choice can have a very real impact on a company's financial statements.
So the company has done the math, and they've figured out the size of the write-down. What happens next? I mean, how does this actually show up on the books? Well, there are a few key rules here. Typically, the loss just gets rolled into the cost of goods sold, but if it's a really big, material amount, it has to be broken out as its own separate line item so investors can see it clearly. But the most important rule of all is that this new, lower value is now the inventory's permanent cost basis, and you absolutely cannot reverse the write-down later on, even if the item's value magically bounces back. That decision is final.
This quote just hammers home that critical point. A write-down isn't some temporary adjustment. It permanently resets that inventory's value on the books. There is no going back.
Which really leaves us with one last big question to think about. We've just seen how using LIFO versus FIFO can lead to a very different write-down amount. So think about it. In the real world, during a time of rapidly changing prices, like high inflation or a sudden recession, how could that one accounting choice dramatically alter a company's reported profits and maybe even change how investors view its financial health? It's a choice with some very real-world consequences.